Well, good afternoon. Today we're in Psalm chapter 69, and I entitled this particular psalm, Being Close to God. And I do that because you're going to see as we look at the psalm that David's closeness to God had enhanced his life or had opened up his life to a number of different things that he would not have experienced if it had not been for his closeness to God. Now, as you begin the psalm, you're going to wonder why I said that, because what you're going to see is David is depressed, he's worn out, he's lonely, he feels isolated. He has been estranged from his family. And so, on the surface, it doesn't look that good for being close to God. So, let's look at this. I think you'll find it beneficial to you, especially if you have experienced some of these things yourself. So, he begins in verses 1 through 5 talking about his deep hurt in life. And so, we'll begin looking at that in verse number 1. He says, deliver me or save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. Now, in the King James, it says soul, but there's a play on the Hebrew word that almost sounds like neck itself. I sink in the mire. Now, I want you to get the picture here. As you look here, there's no standing. It's almost as a fellow who has no standing on a rock, as the waters are starting to overflow him, and he has no standing that his foot slips, he can't hold on to a branch, and so he's in a real desperate situation. Can you imagine what it would be like to be in a desperate situation and it doesn't look like there's any way out of it? I wonder how devastating and how desperate and how overwhelming it must have been for those people back in 9/11. And this is the kind of picture here. It's like he's has nothing to hold on to as the waters are rushing over him, and he's sinking in the mire. And he goes on to say, I have come to deep waters where the floods overflow me. Verse number 3. Notice this. And it's not short term. This is what makes it so difficult. What he's going through is not just temporary, but it seems like it's going on and on and on almost forever. That's why he says, I am weary of crying. It's almost as if you can cry no more. And he says, my throat is parched. And the idea there is that his throat is hoarse just from calling out for help and calling and calling and calling, and there's no answer. Notice that he goes on to say, my eyes are dimmed, of course, from crying. I mean, his tears had dried up his eyes. Notice again, but I wait on God. That's why he said it was prolonged. He's waiting on God, and yet there's no answer. Notice in verse 4, this is an interesting verse. It may seem almost to you out of place for a moment, but he says, they hate me without cause. Now, it's one thing, and it's very difficult, even if they hate you for a good reason. But think about being hated without a cause. In other words, you didn't do anything. You didn't do anything wrong, and yet people hate you. There's no reason for them to hate you. They just do. Notice here, without cause. And he said, these people that hate him are like the hairs on his head. That is, they're numerous. It's bad enough, isn't it, just to have one enemy? That'll keep you up at night. But here David's talking about he's got so many enemies, they're like the hair on his head. Notice again, he says, and they would destroy me. In other words, these people are violent and they're conspiring and they want to kill him. That's what they want to do. Notice again, they that would destroy me, being mine enemies wrongfully, and they're mighty, they're powerful. I mean, he has powerful enemies. Then they say and demand. This is an interesting phrase here at the end of this verse, because then I restore that which I took not away. Think about that. I don't know if the enemies are demanding him to restore something. He didn't steal anything. He didn't take anything wrongly. I don't know if David restored even what he hadn't stolen. Notice in verse number 5, O God, thou knowest my foolishness, my sins are not hid from thee. Now, David, of course, hadn't done anything wrong, but you ever notice sometimes people are very sensitive and their conscience prick them. There are occasions in life that make you think deeply about your own life. You just might say it in a superficial way. Well, I'm not perfect, but here you have a person who is sensitive as he looks into the deep recesses of his heart, he knows that he's not without flaw. Now, when you get down to verse 7, going to another section of the psalm, what we're seeing here is that they're treating David like they would treat God, and the insults that they're hurling at God land on him. In other words, he's the target. And this is a rather, this because, and I mentioned why I called this being close to God, because he's close to God, the insults that they're directing towards God are falling on him. Notice verse 7, because of thy sake I have borne reproach, and shame has covered my name. You recall Jesus said one time in Matthew 5:11, blessed are ye when men revile you, that means to speak against, and they persecute you and say all manner of evil against you. He said, for my name's sake, you're blessed. You know why? Because you're close to God. They treat David like they treat, Jesus said one time, they hated me and they're going to hate you. Isn't that true? There's no reason to hate. Can you imagine? Why in the world would you ever hate God? Why would you hate Jesus? And yet evil men do. They hated him and they ended up crucifying him. And what Jesus is warning his disciples, if they hated me, they're going to hate you too. Now down in verse 8, notice this. And I have become a stranger to my brethren and an alien or a stranger of my mother's children. Think about that. Hated and estranged by his own family because he stood up for God and was close to God, and he was hated for that. Now, for the zeal of my house has eaten me up. By the way, I can't get into this today. We just don't have time. But this psalm that we're looking at today is quoted so oftentimes in the New Testament. You're familiar with this particular verse over in John chapter 2, but let's read it. For the zeal of my house has eaten me up, and the reproaches of them. Think about that. When Jesus had a zeal for his house, a jealousy for God's house at the temple, the people were upset with him because he went in there and tried to clean up that mess, and they reviled him and they reproached him. And that reproach, he said, has fallen on me because his zeal for God, people reproached him. Now notice, I want you to see the effect of that down in verse number 20. Reproach has broken my heart. Now I want you to understand something here. This is not to be taken lightly. When people are approached, it hurts. I mean, they're really approached, and what David says, that reproach that they had against God has fallen on me. I've become the target. And notice this, he says, it's broken my heart. I am full of heaviness, and I look for some to take pity. You want to know what? None did. Nobody took pity on him. And by the way, this gets us back into Matthew chapter 27. And here, when you look for being human, you want some sympathy, don't you? I mean, when you're going through some tough times and some difficult times, you want some kind of empathy. That's just human nature. And what he's saying is, I'm lonely, I'm isolated, my family has deserted me, my friends have deserted me. Here I'm a stranger in my own house. And notice, when I looked for comforters, there wasn't any. They gave me, notice here's another verse down in 21. It's again back into Matthew 27 and so on. They gave me gall. Instead of comforting me, they do just the opposite, don't they? I mean, instead, when you think you ought to be comforted, when you're going through some very, very hard times, instead of people comforting, they actually turn against you. And that's just what he's saying here in verse number 21. They gave me gall for my meat or food, and my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. So what you see here in the psalm has David is close to God. Reproaches fall upon him. But I want you to see something else that's very important in this chapter here. When you get down into verse number 13, being close to God, watch it now, being close to God may mean that people turn against you. That's just absolutely true. Just because you stand up for God, some people are going to hate you for that. You'll be insulted. The target really is God, but it all falls falls upon you. Now, notice here though, but being close to God in verse 13 does something else. Because what you see, but as for me, my prayer was unto thee. Notice in that mess that David was in, O Lord, in an acceptable time, O God, in the multitude of thy steadfast love, thy mercy, hear me in the truth of my salvation. Now, I want you to think something about here. Being close to God enables you to endure through those storms of life. That's what he's saying here. Being close to God may bring trouble upon you, and even those that are close to you. But being close to God also does something else. It allows you to stand. It allows you to persevere. Because of that anchor, you're able to go through it, and that's a tremendous truth. Now, if you look at the rest of the verses following that, you're going to see the circumstances didn't change. He still had to go through it. It was still difficult. It was still breaking his heart. But because he was close to God, he was able to endure and to persevere. How about you? You might be going through some things like that yourself. And I want to just encourage you that if you are, stay close to God. God will get you through it. You can get through it, and keep that always in mind. Keep your heart solid on the Lord. And so these are tremendous Psalms, aren't they? I mean, because they deal with life, they deal with real experiences that we often go through. Life isn't always on the mountain. Sometimes we just have to go through those valleys. But if you stick with Him, stay close to Him, you'll get through it. And so we're looking tomorrow, I guess, already at Psalm chapter 7. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon, same time. Be with me then.